"Rick deserves a fresh start more than you do," my mom declared, her voice carrying a conviction that made my stomach drop. I sat there in stunned silence as she casually mentioned transferring my grandmother's $200,000 inheritance directly into her boyfriend's account. The coffee cup in my hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would shatter everything I thought I understood about our relationship. "He's been through so much, Juliet. His divorce was brutal, and he lost everything. You're young and capable. You have your whole life ahead of you to make money." She said this as if she were discussing the weather, not destroying my financial future. "My name is Juliet Thompson, and I'm 27 years old. I work as a marketing coordinator for Amberlin Ventures here in Charleston, South Carolina. 3 months ago, my beloved grandmother passed away, leaving me her life savings as my inheritance. It wasn't just money to me. It represented her love, her sacrifice, and her belief in my future. She had specifically wanted me to use it for a house down payment or to start my own business. Mom, that money was meant for me. Grandma specifically said, "Your grandmother would understand," she interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "She always believed in helping family, and Rick is family now." Rick had entered our lives 8 months ago, and from the moment I met him, something felt off. He was charming enough, always complimenting my mother's cooking and bringing her flowers. But there was a calculated quality to his kindness that made my skin crawl. At 52, he claimed to be a struggling contractor, but I had never seen evidence of any actual work. "Besides," my mom continued, "you make decent money at that marketing job. Rick needs this more than you do right now." I forced myself to stay calm, even though my heart was pounding. "When did you transfer it?" "This morning. I wanted to tell you before you found out from the bank." Her tone suggested she expected gratitude for this consideration. The casual way she delivered this bombshell told me everything I needed to know about how little my feelings mattered to her. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. She had planned this, probably for weeks. The woman who had raised me, who had taught me about honesty and fairness, had just stolen my inheritance and handed it to a man I barely knew. But instead of exploding, instead of screaming or crying, I felt something else entirely. A cold, calculating calm settling over me. I looked at my mother, this woman who had just betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible, and smiled. "No problem, Mom. I know you love him." My childhood had been complicated, but I had always believed my mother and I shared an unbreakable bond. After my father left when I was 12, it was just the two of us against the world. She worked double shifts as a nurse to keep us afloat, and I did everything I could to be the perfect daughter. Good grades, no trouble, always helpful around the house. My grandmother had been our anchor during those difficult years. Every Sunday, she would have us over for dinner, slipping me $20 bills when my mother wasn't looking, and telling me stories about building her small catering business from nothing. She had immigrated from Ireland with only a suitcase and a dream, eventually saving enough to buy a small house and put my mother through nursing school. "Education and independence," she would tell me. "Those are the only things no one can take away from you, darling." When she passed away from cancer last spring, I thought I had cried all the tears I had. The funeral was small but beautiful, and afterward, her lawyer read the will. The house went to my mother, which I expected, but the savings, all $200,000 of it, came to me with a specific note. For my Juliet's future dreams. My mother had seemed genuinely happy for me then, even helping me research investment options and talking about what kind of business I might want to start. That was before Rick. I had first noticed changes in my mother's behavior about 6 months ago. She started canceling our weekly dinners, claiming she was too tired or had other plans. When I would visit unannounced, I often found Rick there, lounging on our couch like he owned the place. He would greet me with an overly familiar hug and call me kiddo in a way that made my skin crawl. "Your mom's told me so much about you," he would say, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. She's so proud of her successful daughter. But lately, I had started noticing subtle changes in how my mother spoke to me. Little comments about my spending habits, questions about whether I really needed my own apartment when I could save money living at home, suggestions that maybe I was being too ambitious with my career goals. All of these observations, I realize now, had probably been planted by Rick. The most troubling part was how my mother seemed to diminish around him. The strong, independent woman who had raised me alone had started deferring to his opinions on everything from what to watch on television to how to spend her own money. She had even started dressing differently, trading her comfortable nursing scrubs for the kind of revealing outfits he preferred. Now, sitting in my mother's kitchen as she justified giving away my inheritance, I understood that the woman I had known and loved was disappearing. Rick hadn't just stolen my money, he had stolen my mother too. But I wasn't going to let him win. Not without a fight. I left my mother's house that afternoon with my mind already racing through possibilities. The betrayal cut deep, but beneath the hurt was something else, a cold determination I had inherited from my grandmother. She hadn't built her business by being passive, and I wouldn't reclaim my future by sitting around feeling sorry for myself. The first thing I did was call my grandmother's lawyer, Mr. Harrison. He had handled her affairs for over 20 years, and had known our family since I was a child. "Juliet, I'm so sorry to hear about this situation," he said, after I explained what had happened. "Your grandmother was very specific about her wishes regarding that inheritance." "Is there anything we can do legally?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Unfortunately, since your mother was the executor of the estate and the money had already been distributed to you, she technically had access to transfer it. However, there might be other options we can explore." We scheduled a meeting for the following day. As I hung up, I realized I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Rick might have charmed my mother, but I had a feeling his sob story about losing everything in a divorce might not be entirely accurate. That evening, I did what any good marketing coordinator would do. I researched social media, public records, business licenses, court documents. By 2 a.m., I had painted a very different picture of Rick Morrison than the one my mother had been sold. Far from being a victim of circumstances, Rick was a serial manipulator, with a pattern of targeting older women. I found 3 previous relationships over the past 5 years, each following the same script. He would meet them through dating apps, present himself as a down-on-his-luck contractor or small business owner, and slowly work his way into their finances. 2 of the women had filed restraining orders against him. Most interesting was a civil court case from 18 months ago, where his previous girlfriend had successfully sued him for $15,000 he had borrowed and never repaid. The court documents painted a clear picture of his tactics: isolation, financial manipulation, and emotional abuse designed to make his victims dependent on his approval. But what really caught my attention was his business history. Rick claimed to be a contractor, but his only business registration had been suspended for failure to pay taxes. He had no contractor's license, no insurance, and no legitimate source of income. The man my mother was supporting was essentially a professional con artist. Armed with this information, I felt the pieces of a plan beginning to form. Rick had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated me. He saw a young woman who could be dismissed and discounted, but my grandmother had raised me better than that. I spent the rest of the night making notes and preparing for what would be a very different kind of battle than Rick was expecting. He had stolen my inheritance, but I was about to give him an education in consequences. The game was about to begin, and this time, I would be the one setting the rules. My meeting with Mr. Harrison the next morning confirmed what I had suspected. Legally, my options were limited. My mother had technically been within her rights to transfer the money, since she had been named as a backup beneficiary if anything happened to me. It was a loophole that Rick had clearly researched and exploited. "However," Mr. Harrison said, leaning back in his leather chair, "there are some interesting clauses in your grandmother's will that might apply here. She was very concerned about protecting her legacy from what she called fortune hunters." He pulled out a thick folder and began reading. There's a provision that if the inheritance is used for purposes contrary to her stated wishes, specifically if it's given to someone outside the family for personal gain, the executor can be held legally responsible for breach of fiduciary duty. My heart skipped. What does that mean exactly? It means your mother could be required to repay the full amount, plus penalties and legal fees. But we would need to prove that Rick manipulated her into the transfer and that it goes against your grandmother's explicit intentions. I thought about the research I had compiled the night before. What if I could prove that Rick has a history of financial manipulation and that he specifically targeted my mother for her assets? Mr. Harrison's eyebrows rose. That would certainly strengthen our case considerably. I spent the next 3 days gathering more evidence. I contacted Rick's previous victims, and 2 of them agreed to speak with me. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar to what I was watching happen to my mother. The pattern was always the same: charm, isolation, financial dependency, and then exploitation. But I needed more than just evidence of Rick's past behavior. I needed to catch him in the act. That's when I decided to pay my mother an unexpected visit. I arrived at her house on Thursday evening with takeout from her favorite restaurant and a carefully planned conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told her as we sat at her kitchen table. "Maybe you're right about Rick needing a fresh start." My mother's face lit up with relief. "Oh, Juliet, I'm so glad you understand. Rick has been so worried that you hate him." "Not at all," I lied smoothly. "In fact, I'd love to get to know him better. Maybe the 3 of us could have dinner this weekend?" What I didn't mention was that I had already arranged for a private investigator to be watching the house. If Rick was running the same con I suspected he would start pushing for more money soon. The inheritance was just the beginning. Sure enough, when Rick arrived home an hour later, he seemed surprised but pleased to see me there. "Juliet, your mom said you were upset about the money situation. I hope there are no hard feelings," he said, flashing that practiced smile. "Of course not," I replied. "Family takes care of family, right?" The conversation that followed was enlightening. Rick had clearly been planning his next moves carefully. He casually mentioned some investment opportunities he was looking into, home improvement projects that would increase the property value, and a business venture he was considering that would set them up for life. Each suggestion involved spending more of my mother's money. "The thing is," Rick said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "opportunities like this don't come around often, but they do require some capital to get started." My mother was hanging on his every word, already mentally calculating how much she could liquidate from her retirement savings. I watched this manipulation in real time, seeing how expertly Rick played on her emotions and her desire to be supportive. But what really sealed my resolve was what happened after Rick went to the bathroom. My mother leaned across the table and whispered, "I think Rick might propose soon. He's been hinting about wanting to make things official." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about my inheritance. Rick was planning to marry my mother and gain access to everything she owned: her house, her pension, her life insurance. I was watching a predator systematically destroy everything my grandmother had worked to build. That night, I went home and finalized my plan. Rick wanted to play games with my family's future? Fine. But he was about to learn that some games have consequences he never saw coming. The next phase of my plan required patience and precision. I spent the following week playing the role of the supportive daughter, agreeing with my mother's decisions, and even offering to help Rick with his business research. What he didn't know was that every conversation was being carefully documented. My private investigator, a woman named Janet who specialized in fraud cases, had been busy gathering evidence of Rick's activities. She discovered that he was not only pursuing my mother, but had been simultaneously dating 2 other women in nearby cities. Each relationship followed the same pattern, with Rick presenting himself as a different type of struggling professional to match what he thought each woman wanted to hear. "He's running what we call a long-term romance scam," Janet explained during our meeting at a coffee shop downtown. Most people think of these as quick online cons, but Rick's version is more sophisticated. He invests months building emotional dependency before making his financial moves. She handed me a folder full of surveillance photos and financial records. The good news is that his pattern makes him predictable. The bad news is that your mother is already in deep. The evidence was overwhelming. Rick had been using my inheritance money to fund his other relationships, including paying for hotel rooms and expensive dinners with his other targets. He had also started applying for credit cards using my mother's address, apparently planning to run up debt in her name. But the most damning evidence came from a recorded phone conversation between Rick and one of his other marks, a widow named Patricia from Savannah. Janet had managed to obtain the recording through Patricia's cooperation, and Rick's words made my blood run cold. "The nurse is completely hooked," Rick's voice came through clearly. "I've got her convinced that her daughter is selfish and ungrateful. By Christmas, I'll have access to everything: the house, the pension, the life insurance. Then I can cut the daughter out completely and we'll be set." Hearing him refer to my mother as the nurse while planning to destroy our relationship was the final confirmation I needed. This wasn't just theft, it was a calculated attack on our entire family. That weekend, I put the next phase of my plan into motion. I invited my mother and Rick to dinner at an upscale restaurant, claiming I wanted to celebrate their relationship properly. What they didn't know was that I had also invited someone else to join us. "Mom, Rick, I'd like you to meet my friend Janet," I said, as the private investigator appeared at our table. "She's been helping me with some research for a work project." Rick's face went slightly pale, but he maintained his composure. "Nice to meet you, Janet. What kind of research?" "Actually, I specialize in investigating fraud cases," Janet said pleasantly, taking the seat next to my mother. "Juliet asked me to look into some concerning financial activities in the area." The color drained from Rick's face entirely. My mother looked confused, glancing between Janet and me with growing alarm. "I don't understand," my mother said. "What does this have to do with us?" I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder Janet had given me. "Mom, there's something you need to know about Rick's background." What followed was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I watched my mother's face change as Janet methodically presented the evidence: the previous victims, the court cases, the active investigations in other cities. Rick sat frozen, clearly calculating whether he could still salvage the situation. "This is ridiculous," he finally said, his charm facade cracking. "Juliet is obviously jealous of our relationship and she's making this all up." But the evidence spoke for itself, and my mother wasn't stupid. She had been manipulated, but she wasn't blind. The real shock came when Janet revealed the recorded conversation. As Rick's voice filled the restaurant, describing his plans to isolate my mother and steal everything my grandmother had worked for, I watched 20 years of my mother's nursing experience kick in. She might have been vulnerable to emotional manipulation, but she knew a predator when she saw one. The restaurant scene ended with Rick storming out, claiming we were all crazy bitches who would regret messing with him. My mother sat in stunned silence, processing the reality of what she had been drawn into. But the night was far from over. "There's more, isn't there?" my mother asked quietly as we sat in Janet's car outside the restaurant. I nodded. "Mom, we need to go to the police tonight. Rick has been using your information to apply for credit, and there's evidence he's planning to escalate his financial crimes." What I hadn't told my mother yet was the most disturbing part of Janet's investigation. Rick wasn't just a con artist. He had a history of violence when his schemes were threatened. 2 of his previous victims had been hospitalized after confronting him, though charges had been dropped when the women became too frightened to testify. Detective Williams at the Charleston Police Department was already familiar with Rick's activities. Apparently, they had been building a case against him for months, but had been waiting for enough evidence to ensure a conviction. "Your mother's case could be the key we need," Detective Williams explained as we sat in the police station at 10 p.m. "If she's willing to cooperate, we can add her testimony to what we already have from his other victims." My mother surprised me with her strength. Despite the emotional trauma of realizing how thoroughly she had been manipulated, she insisted on making a full statement that night. She detailed every financial transaction, every manipulation tactic, and every red flag she had ignored because she wanted to believe in love. "I feel so stupid," she whispered as we finally headed home at 2 a.m. "You're not stupid, Mom. You're trusting. There's a difference." But the real drama was just beginning. The next morning, Rick showed up at my mother's house demanding entry. What he didn't know was that Janet's team had installed security cameras the previous evening, and everything was being recorded. "You think you can just destroy my life?" Rick shouted through the front door. "I know where you work, where your precious daughter lives. This isn't over." The threats were exactly what the police needed to arrest him immediately. By noon, Rick was in custody, and Detective Williams was at my mother's house explaining the charges. Financial fraud, identity theft, criminal threats, and violation of a restraining order from his previous victim in Savannah. Detective Williams read from his notes. We also found evidence on his phone of communications with known check fraud operations. The scope of Rick's criminal activities was staggering. He hadn't just been running romance scams. He had been part of a larger network of financial criminals operating across 3 states. My inheritance money had been used to fund check kiting schemes and fraudulent business operations. "The good news," Detective Williams continued, "is that we've recovered most of the money. It was still sitting in accounts Rick controlled, probably because he planned to use it as seed money for bigger cons. By the end of the week, I had my inheritance back, plus interest and damages that Rick was required to pay as part of his plea agreement. He was facing 15 years in federal prison, and his entire network was being dismantled. But beyond the money, something more important had been restored. My mother and I spent hours talking about what had happened, how Rick had manipulated our relationship, and how we could rebuild the trust that had been damaged. "Your grandmother would be proud of how you handled this," my mother said, as we sorted through Rick's belongings that the police had released back to her. I thought about my grandmother's words about education and independence being the only things no one could take away. She had been right, but she had taught me something else too. Sometimes the best way to protect what you love is to fight for it. 3 weeks after Rick's arrest, I was at my desk at Amberlin Ventures when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's number, but when I answered, I heard something I hadn't expected. Tears. "Juliet, I'm so sorry," my mother sobbed. "I'm so sorry for everything I put you through. I should have listened to you from the beginning." The emotional breakthrough had come that morning, when my mother received the final police report detailing the full extent of Rick's crimes. She learned that he had been planning to forge her will, had already stolen her identity to open credit accounts, and had been gradually isolating her from me as part of a systematic plan to gain total control over her life. "The detective said if you hadn't acted when you did, I could have lost everything," she continued. "The house, my pension, my relationship with you. I almost lost my daughter trying to save a man who was planning to destroy us both." I could hear the weight of realization in her voice. Rick hadn't just stolen money. He had nearly succeeded in destroying our family entirely. "Mom, you don't need to apologize," I said gently. "You were manipulated by someone who makes a living exploiting people's capacity for love." But she wasn't finished. "I need you to know that I'm getting counseling. I want to understand how I let this happen so it never happens again. And I'm going to make this right, I promise." The conversation that followed was the most honest we had shared in years. My mother told me about the loneliness she had felt since my father left, how Rick had made her feel valued and desired in a way she hadn't experienced in decades. She also admitted that she had been jealous of my independence and success, feelings that Rick had expertly exploited to drive a wedge between us. "He knew exactly what to say to make me feel like you were moving away from me," she explained. "He made me believe that taking your inheritance was a way of keeping you close, of making you need your family again." The manipulation had been even more sophisticated than I had realized. Rick had been playing a long game, using my mother's deepest fears and insecurities to turn her against me while positioning himself as her protector and provider. The aftermath of Rick's downfall rippled through the community in ways I hadn't anticipated. Detective Williams contacted me to say that our case had helped them identify and assist 12 other victims across 3 states. The network Rick had been part of was systematically dismantled, with total recovered damages exceeding $1.2 million. But the personal impact went beyond the financial recovery. My mother and I began attending family counseling together, working to rebuild the trust and communication that Rick had damaged. The sessions were difficult but healing, helping us understand how predators like Rick identify and exploit family dynamics. Manipulators look for existing cracks in relationships, our counselor explained. They don't create problems, they amplify ones that already exist. My mother surprised me with her determination to transform her experience into something positive. She began volunteering with a local organization that helped elder abuse victims, using her nursing background and personal experience to provide support and education. "I want other women to recognize the warning signs I missed," she told me as we prepared materials for her first presentation. "If sharing my story can save even one family from what we went through, then maybe some good can come from this nightmare." Meanwhile, I found myself reflecting on the lessons my grandmother had taught me about strength and independence. She had survived immigration, built a business, and raised a family through sheer determination. When faced with someone trying to destroy that legacy, I had channeled her spirit and fought back. The inheritance money, when it was finally returned to my account, felt different somehow. It wasn't just my grandmother's gift anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of family bonds that couldn't be broken by manipulation, and of the importance of standing up for what you believe in. I decided to use part of it exactly as my grandmother had intended, to start my own marketing consultancy, specializing in helping small businesses build authentic relationships with their communities. It seemed fitting to use money that had nearly been stolen through deception to build something based on trust and honesty. Rick Morrison received a 15-year federal sentence for his crimes, with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. His other accomplices in the financial fraud network received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. The judge specifically noted that Rick's systematic targeting of vulnerable women showed a callous disregard for human dignity that warranted the maximum sentence. His appeals were denied, and he lost all rights to contact any of his victims. Meanwhile, the 3 women he had been simultaneously manipulating each received full restitution, and 2 of them started a support group for romance scam survivors that now helps hundreds of people across the Southeast. Looking back on those months of betrayal and recovery, I realized that my grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the money she left me. It had been the strength and wisdom she had instilled in me to fight for what was right, even when the battle seemed impossible to win.